Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Park Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation.
This is a different kind of appointee that we're seeing in the three from Donald Trump. He vowed to appoint justices who would overturn Roe v. Wade. He appoints three, and all three of them vote to overturn Roe v. Wade.
Hello, I'm Bonnie Bay. Welcome to the Contrary, a weekly discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. The Supreme Court, formerly considered one of, if not the most nonpartisan branch of government, now feared by some in the country because it has become so partisan. How did it go from one end to the other? Joan Biskupic has covered the Supreme Court since 1989. Her new book, 9 Black Robes, pulls back the curtain on the Supreme Court and explains how it has become so political. So welcome to the program, Joan, and thank you for your time, which is in huge demand right now, I understand. You've been covering the court since 89. Who has been appointed in that time who have made the biggest difference in the court?
First of all, I've been covering it that long, but so have you, Bonnie. And I remember vividly seeing you in the Supreme Court press room ages ago. Well, first of all, this new book I have is more of a group portrait, 9 Black Robes. But earlier, I focused on individual justices. And the first was Sandra Day O'Connor. And when I came to the beat, in the late 80s, early 90s, Sandra Day O'Connor was practically Chief Justice because her vote controlled so much. Remember that? And, she's still alive. She just turned 93, and she is definitely an icon for our time. But so much of her legacy is now being rolled back because we have such a new court. So I first say, just speaking back in those early days when you and I were together in the press room, Sandra Day O'Connor was so critical. Chief Justice William Rehnquist was overseeing things. And interestingly, those two were old pals from their time in Arizona. But, she controlled. And then with time, with, additional justices, especially in the 4 years of Donald Trump, everything has been transformed. We have such a different court. Not only do we not have Sandra Day O'Connor at the center, Anthony Kennedy, who left in 2018 and took on her center point, is gone. And you and I would have never thought of thinking of Chief Justice John Roberts as the center of the court, but he actually was after Justices O'Connor and Kennedy left. But now he's been displaced also with these three Trump appointees: Neil Gorsuch in 2017, Brett Kavanaugh in 2018, having succeeded Justice Kennedy, and then Amy Coney Barrett with this huge transformation, because here is a very conservative jurist having succeeded this liberal bulwark, Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
And of course, the Roberts Court now, the current Roberts Court, is probably most famous for the Dobbs decision of the summer of 2022, when the court threw out the federally protected right to abortion. So do you think these three, simultaneously, political trust in the court on the part of the American public has gone downhill? Do you think that is why?
I can speak to the polls. This is the only way I understand what public reaction has been to the court. Certainly I sense a certain despair among people I know on the left, a certain glee among people I know on the right. But when you look at public opinion polls that sweep in people right, left, and center, there is a disillusionment about the integrity of the court, because a lot of people see the recent rulings as coming from political instincts, not necessarily legal ones. And I'm just repeating what pollsters have found, and it's not a single poll; it's multiple polls. But they mostly arise, that sentiment arises out of the Dobbs decision in June that rolled back nearly a half century of abortion rights. Roe v. Wade had been upheld year after year, decade after decade, by courts that were dominated by other types of Republican appointees. And I would include Sandra Day O'Connor and Anthony Kennedy right there in that. And of course, Harry Blackmun, who wrote Roe v. Wade. But this is a different kind of appointee that we're seeing in the three from Donald Trump, for better or for worse. And as I said, there are plenty of people who are very happy with the trio that Donald Trump put on, but they seem to have come with the agenda that Donald Trump had. He vowed to appoint justices who would overturn Roe v. Wade. He appoints three, and all three of them vote to overturn Roe v. Wade. And John Roberts, no friend of abortion rights, certainly, dissented from the part of the opinion that completely rolled back Roe. So my point is that this is a different kind of court, different Republican appointees. And Bonnie, one more thing, these three Trump appointees are very young in the whole scheme of things. It's nice to think of people in their 50s as practically teenagers on the court, but that's what they are. And they will be with America for a very long time. And I've seen studies that say essentially this kind of right-wing dominated court will be here for about 50 more years.
So why, for example, and pardon my use of the term, but why would the Trump appointees be seen as more or less political hacks, but not the Democratic appointees who are partisan as well? I mean, it's when let me back up and say, when I first started covering the court, and I had at that point relatively recently gotten out of law school, I thought that judges were not partisan. But the more time I spent up there, I realized that the Justice Souters of the world, who truly was nonpartisan, were few and far between. So tell me how that is impacting how they vote.
That's a very good point, and I think it's a good one. That there are plenty of people on the right who say, the media, the critics focus on the 6 Republican appointed justices and how they often vote consistently on the right wing. But the 3 Democratic appointees right now, Justices Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, and Ketanji Brown Jackson, all tend to vote very liberal. So that reinforces it. It's just that right now, not only are the Republican appointees, voting fairly consistently, they're also rolling back precedent. And that's what's also gotten attention. When you think of Republican appointees from the past who wanted, who believed that some of the precedents from the 1960s and 70s were wrong, they let them stand just because there is that principle in the law of stare decisis, as it's said in Latin, but the idea that courts will adhere to precedent, and that has changed. That is a change. But I think that for our audience, I would say definitely it cuts both ways, that we have a trio of liberals who are Democratic appointees. They just don't have the power. They don't have the power that the right wing has right now.
Certainly, they don't have the numbers that the conservative justice have. Now, you write in your book about that after Justice Ginsburg died, her office was cleaned out immediately. Was this from Justice John Roberts?
Yes,
why did this happen?
I found that whole episode to be very symbolic. Okay, so Ruth Bader Ginsburg had obviously been dying for several months. She kept being hospitalized, and her staff very much preoccupied with trying to get her material so that she could decide cases, whether she was at home, in the hospital, or at the court. And remember, we were still in COVID for most of that time. And soon after her burial service, her staff got word that they had to clear out immediately. They wouldn't have time to sort through things in her chambers, that they had to bring everything downstairs to a dark, windowless theater space on the ground floor, which you probably remember that space. In the olden days, the pre-COVID days, tourists used to be able to go in there and watch a short film on court operations, but this was an empty space and they had to bring everything down there. And that upset so many people through the building that there was this mandate to do it quickly, so that the chambers that Justice Ginsburg had occupied could quickly get ready for the new justice, which of course became Amy Coney Barrett. I found that very symbolic, though, of Justice Ginsburg's legacy, because so quickly it was reversed on reproductive rights. So it was just an episode that I thought was revealing of some of the people in the court and some of the tensions that arose, not just around cases, but court practices.
Now, do you think you talk also in the book about how the justices, what they went through in Supreme Court hearings. And I recall from Clarence Thomas through Justice Kavanaugh, and I quite frankly I don't cover the court anymore, haven't for decades, but how Kavanaugh in particular, when asked about Roe v. Wade, what his position would be, and he said, I believe in stare decisis, which roughly translated from Latin meaning that the decision, leave it alone. What is there, and that's the law of the land. So when justices tell the Senate Judiciary Committee that they believe in stare decisis and then act completely oppositely once they are on the court, is that lying?
Well, you have watched enough confirmation hearings to know that the mission of any nominee is to simply get approved with as few missteps as possible. So they're naturally going to try to minimize any complaint of their answers, that they're going to try to seem as mild-mannered and non-controversial as possible. I would hesitate to say that they were lying. They could always say, I generally adhere to precedent. Sometimes it needs to be overturned, but I generally adhere to it. And I think that's the way they went. Now, it was so soon after they all came on the bench that they found it pretty easy to discard precedent. So I think you just have to take their actions as they stand.
And tell me what you have found out about Justice Gorsuch, covering him now since former President Trump appointed him.
Well, he's a very interesting figure, and you'll see in my book, Bonnie, I'm very much intrigued by his, not just his legal roots, but his personal roots, because his mother was quite interesting. She was the first female administrator of the of the EPA, and she had a rough time in Washington. In fact, the Reagan administration people who chose her ended up turning against her, and he was just a teenager at the time. And she even wrote about him in her book, which she titled "Are You Tough Enough?" which tells you a little bit about Ann Gorsuch, who has passed away. But she's so he's got a very independent streak, and he has didn't want to play the role of freshman justice. And I think that his record is intriguing. He's mostly a consistent conservative, but I'll tell you where he breaks from the right on some criminal defense cases, and where he's really set out a different path has been on Indian rights, Native American rights. He's played a key role there.
So any other areas? Because those are the ones you mentioned are relatively non-controversial, certainly when compared with things like abortion rights or civil rights, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I'll tell you something that it is controversial, and it again traces to his anti-regulatory bent, but also again just as his mother did. His mother acted to roll back regulations, and Neil Gorsuch is sort of the embodiment of someone who is against the so-called administrative state. White House counsel Don McGahn talking about why he chose, why he was part of the team that chose Neil Gorsuch, why they settled on him, referred to his background and even his mother's background. Don McGahn commented in one speech that, you know, his mother wasn't head of the EPA, but he shared with Neil Gorsuch that same kind of resistance for regulation, whether it be over the environment, public health, campaign finance, as you know, that this court and Don McGahn certainly have fought over the years.
Now, would you say that Gorsuch, I'm thinking about Justice Antonin Scalia, who passed away a few years ago, and he and Ruth Bader Ginsburg couldn't have been more opposite politically, but very close friends and both great intellects. But I remember covering Scalia in the flag burning case, which must have been in the late 80s up until
yeah, there was one in
90s.
like 89 and 90, two of them went up there.
And, right. And he was in favor of allowing a protester against the government to burn a flag. And of course, back then anyway, and everything has been thrown up in the air since then in terms of party positions on various things, or most everything has been. Back then, that was seen as a liberal approach. Do these three justices maintain any of those positions when it comes to free speech rights?
You know, it's interesting. Free speech rights do tend to dissolve some ideological labels. And in that flag burning case, you know, you think of Justice John Paul Stevens, he was on the other side, even though he was regarded as a liberal. And that will come. That comes in some situations, especially in, you know, for example, intellectual property. We haven't seen it so much on First Amendment issues in recent years because many of them have been entangled with religious rights and with also ideologically charged issues. But I imagine that as each of these Trump appointees settle in, we might see some surprises, some increased differentiation among the three. It is, as you mentioned, still fairly early for all of them. Justice Barrett has only been on the court since late 2020, and she has separated herself from those other two on a couple of low-profile death penalty issues. So we'll just have to see. I actually think that we just still don't have many data points to assess Justice Barrett yet.
And what do you see? How long do you think? I mean, I know I'm asking you to predict when justices are going to pass away, that sort of thing, but it took 50 years, just about, right, for the conservatives to get a majority on the court. And do you think it will take another 50 years, for example, if ever the court reinstates Roe or in some form so that there are national protections for women's health rights?
Bonnie, I do not think this Supreme Court is going to suddenly, or even over many years, even decades, declare again a constitutional right to abortion. It will not be in your lifetime, likely not in mine, and likely not in my daughter's lifetime either.
Why? Because of how long it took?
Well, because of who they have on the court. You know, they've not. As I said, the conservatives are the younger ones, and you know, I just don't see that happening. I think that if there's going to be a right to abortion in individual states, it's going to be in individual states. I just don't see a change coming in the near future.
The dissent in Dobbs said that something to the effect of, don't expect this to be the end of it. Does that mean the court is going to ban the sale of chemical or medical abortions?
Well, you're asking about a case that could be up there soon, the question of medication abortions. And we certainly have a case pending down in Texas right now that involves that. And the statement that you're talking about, let's see if I can quickly find my book here. Here's the line. No one should be confident that this majority is done with its work. And I think that that's exactly what the warning was from the 3 liberals on the bench who dissented from the Dobbs opinion. Yes.
What is the mood among the justices? I know when I covered Congress, for example, in the 1980s, early 80s, until I went to the Supreme Court in, I think, 88 or 89, Tip O'Neill and Bob Michel, then the minority leader, and Tip, of course, the speaker, would argue vociferously on the House floor, polar opposite positions on many laws, not all, but many. And then what Michel would, of course, lose because the Democrats had a 40-year majority in the House of Representatives. They'd go into the speaker's lobby, slap each other on the back, and go play golf at the Congressional Country Club. Is that happening at the Supreme Court? Because we do have the history of Scalia and Ruth Bader Ginsburg being close. Or is this new crop as hateful against liberals as conservatives are in the House of Representatives?
Well, I'll make this my last question because I can see I keep getting beeped there, but because I'm working right now, I'm getting beeped. So let me just tell you, because it is an interesting question that a lot of people want to know, what are they like as real people? So I guess I would say in terms of the relationships, the jury is still out, Bonnie. We do not have another pair like Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Nino Scalia, who would go to the opera together all the time, have dinner together all the time, spend their New Year's Eves together. I think because they are the only ones in their life who really understand what their job is like, they try to have some friendships, palships. They still eat lunch together after oral arguments, as you might remember from the old days. But what they're missing are people like Justice O'Connor, who is the social glue of the court. They're missing now Stephen Breyer, who really worked hard to get along with everyone. Elena Kagan does go golfing, but I don't think she has a golfing partner among the justices. She might, because she would be someone who has some political instincts like you've just described, to try to get along both on the bench and off. But right now, the kind of polarization that you see outside the court certainly is shading what goes on inside the court.
I have 2 more questions. One is, would you regard Mitch McConnell, of course, the then Senate Majority Leader, as having stolen 2 appointments away from Barack Obama, 2 Supreme Court appointments?
Well, Bonnie, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. And I devote an entire chapter called The Triumvirate to Mitch McConnell, Leonard Leo, and Don McGahn because of the hand they had in everything, including ensuring that President Obama did not get any kind of hearing or regard for his nomination of Merrick Garland. But I personally would not use the word stolen. I will leave that to you, though.
All right. And then the Nancy Pelosi, we recently interviewed her, and she said, former speaker, of course, and she said that the court has traditionally been a court of, or at least in the 20th century, a court of enlarging human rights, civil rights, and now it's become a court of decreasing those rights. Where do you see that as happening most frequently? And again, is that going to be the case as long as the now 6 justice majority of conservatives is at least a 5-person majority?
I think that Nancy Pelosi nailed it. I would mention one exception, though. First, I'll say that yes, I envision more diminishing of certain rights, individual rights, lowering of the separation between church and state, likely rollback more on reproductive rights, likely also on racial remedies. But the one area, and I'll leave you with this, the one area that they are expanding, Second Amendment rights. They have allowed much a more robust reading of the Second Amendment and many more limits on gun control across the country. Thanks again for doing this.
Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. That's it for this edition. Let's keep the conversation going on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Please visit our PBS webpage, www.tothecontrary.org. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next time.
Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Park Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation. For a transcript or to see an online version of this episode of To the Contrary, please visit our PBS website at pbs.org/To the Contrary.
You're watching PBS.